Live from Brooklyn, welcome to the SYCK Podcast, starring Alan Stein, where he steers your career with Kadima. Along with Alan, I'm Russ Reba, and I've got 3 words for you. Job, acquisition, method. But Alan, it sounds so much better as jam. We've got jam sessions today.
I love the jam. After this recording, actually, I'm going to get a peanut butter and jam sandwich with that Kirkland signature jam, by the way.
You gotta love Costco.
Yep.
All right, so it's going to be with Kelly O'Brien, who works with Kadima, one of your employees. Is that right?
She was one of our first employees here at Kadima. She's an awesome woman. I met her at Simon School of Business, one of the top MBA programs in the country and the most diverse MBA program, I believe, in the world.
So, we talk a lot about business, the business of what you do, but, listeners are kind of getting to know you. Each episode, you give us a little bit of insight of what you do kind of when you're not working. So anything new this week? Anything happening with you?
Yeah, so recently I was all excited for my family, my sister, her family, my mom, going on our first post-COVID vacation. And
nice.
My mom planned it out. Yeah, we were all looking forward to it, to go up to the Poconos in Pennsylvania, about a 2.5-hour drive from my house, and this lovely resort called Woodloch Pines, where we've gone several years in a row.
Uh-huh.
We all took precautions for COVID, and as soon as we get there, my mom comes down with the sniffles.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and she's like, "Oh, don't worry, I don't have COVID." And my wife, who's a doctor, asked my mom, "How do you know that?" And was able to convince my mom to take a COVID test. And surprise, surprise, my mom had COVID. Positive. So my mom, who was looking forward to this for all this time, she was holed up in her room. We had to rearrange all the other living conditions.
Yeah.
So we had 4 adults in our room with 2 16-year-old stinky boys sharing their bathroom with their mom and dad, and my daughter Jasmine went to her aunt and uncle's room.
Most importantly, how did mom do with it?
She survived, and after 3 days with a long weekend, she felt a little bit better. By Monday, we gave a nice tip to the hospitality staff, and fortunately, knock on wood, my mom is doing okay now.
Very good. Good to hear. Nobody else got it?
No one else at that time. No,
Okay.
I was just recovering from it myself.
I remember that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear. Best wishes to mom and the whole family. And hopefully you did get a little bit of enjoyment from the vacation after being holed up in Brooklyn.
I did. And now I'm excited to be back accelerating careers.
Very good. And speaking of that, Kelly O'Brien, she's going to be, I guess, the star of the jam session today.
Yeah, let's give her starring credit. I think she came up with some great questions to fire away with me. And lots of good questions about the interview process, from what sort of questions the big tech companies ask, how to prepare for behavioral-based interview methods, and how damn predictable these interviews are. And if you understand what's coming at you, you can do all that much better and land the job.
Excellent. Let's get into jam sessions with Kelly O'Brien.
So we had one of these episodes earlier about the application process. Today, we're going to talk about the interview process. And then there's going to be a third episode in this same vein about negotiations. But today, we're going to dig deep into some common questions and some common misunderstood concepts about interviewing. So with that, I'm going to shut my trap, hand it off to Kelly, who is based in Rochester, New York, home of Jenny Beer, home of Wegmans. Well, it's not the home of, but they definitely have some Wegmans there. I think home of Kodak at some point, and some other big tech companies were up there as well, which I think IBM had a big presence up there at some point as well. But anyway, I'm going to shut up, hand it off to Kelly.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so as Alan said, I just finished my MBA at the University of Rochester Simon Business School. I've been working with Kadima throughout my entire second year of business school. So the interview process is something that I've gone through quite a few times in the last couple of years, something that comes up very frequently for our SYCK Podcast listeners and for all of our Kadima clients. So I thought it would be cool to ask Alan some of the questions that were on my mind, particularly as I was going through the process. as well as the questions that you might be asking yourself, particularly when you're thinking about getting a job in big tech. So without further ado, let's kick it off. Alan, can you tell us what some of the big tech companies look for candidates when they're looking to hire them? So what matters most, when we think about it? Is it experience? Is it credentials? Do I want to have sort of brand names on my resume? What kind of skills can I bring that's really going to set me apart?
Yeah, Kelly, good question. And I'll talk first about like what the FANGs and the biggest tech companies look for. So when I was a hiring manager working with a recruiter, opening up a job requirement, I would sit down with a recruiter and he or she would ask me what I was looking for in a candidate. And we would talk about the type of skills that they had. We would talk about the years of experience they had. But what those recruiters would often ask me is, what sort of companies do you want these people coming from? And that was a very informative question that really helped to hone down the candidate pool. Also, what sort of titles are we looking for in these individuals? And what sort of schools are you looking for? So that's how we identified a lot of our candidates when we did our proactive sourcing. We would look for candidates with certain company backgrounds. We would look for people with certain titles. So if I was hiring program managers, we would be looking for people with program management or project management. If I was hiring people for customer success, we'd look for people with customer success management or customer success operations or program management. And then we would be looking for schools as well, depending on how far out they were. So those are some of the big areas that we would look for in terms of sourcing talent. And then when we look at the resume, we would look for some other things before we interview. So we'd want to see progression within roles, and we would want to see quantifiable impact. So not just that I led a sales team, that I led a 50-person sales team, but I led a 50-person sales team that increased our revenue by 22%, which was 50% more than the second best person on my team. So things of that nature.
Cool. Yeah, I think we've touched on that in previous jam sessions before, especially the one that we had talking about the application process. Can you talk a bit about how those things that are showing up on your resume that hopefully are going to get you noticed by the recruiter should show up in the narrative? Because I know that we talk a lot about how every interview is going to start off with, tell me about yourself. How would you recommend approaching translating that resume that is this, document with lots of numbers and percentages on it to something that sounds personable and also gets your point across?
Great question. First off, you have to realize that a resume is only going to be looked at between 6 and 60 seconds. There's lots of research there. I can tell you anecdotally for myself. That's how long I look at a resume. Then the narrative, or the tell me about yourself, is typically the first question of almost every interview. So if I'm interviewing you, Kelly, for a role on my team, I'd be like, oh, walk me through your resume, or tell me a little bit about yourself. And essentially, what I'm asking for is not to understand your story from birth to today, but a little narrative, 3 to 4 minutes max, about where you're coming from, why you are here today, and what interests you about this role and this company. It's sometimes a little bit less relevant for the company. So when I was hiring at Google or Facebook, people just assumed that people wanted to work there. So you didn't have to demonstrate to me that I want to work for one of those companies. Facebook is now in a little bit different spot than when I was there, but it used to be a very attractive company to work for. It's still fairly attractive to work for. But you would need to convey to me of why you're leaving your current role and what brought you here to this role and to this company. So some clear alignment with values or interest in the product or interest in the role, and also clear alignment on what you've done in the past and how that translates to this role. You need to do that in 3 to 4 minutes. So you practice that and make sure that you're conveying that. And one thing I failed to mention at the beginning of the tell me about yourself, and this usually occurs before the tell me about yourself or the narrative, build rapport with your interviewer. What you're essentially trying to do, they are the decision maker. You are trying to influence them to make a positive decision on you. The way you do that, you help make them like you. You build rapport, you talk about something interesting, you talk about the weather, whatever. So in the narrative, you tell them about what brought you here, why you're here, why this role. And the last thing that I like to finish it up with is something personal. like what I always use on a personal note. I live in Brooklyn with my 3 birds, my 3 kids, my 2 dogs, and my 1 incredible wife. And usually that gets some sort of commentary that people either have dogs, birds, kids, have been to Brooklyn before, or something. And that leads to some casual conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think in this era of Zoom interviewing too, it can always be helpful just to ask, where are you calling in from? And then use that as a place to start riffing. Makes it a bit easier since you're not in the same room together. Somebody's probably in a different city as you, if not a different country. So that helps quite a bit as well.
Very true.
Cool. So let's talk a bit about the general structure of the interview process. So I know we've talked a lot about the recruiter screen in a previous episode. Tell me what happens after, I talk to the recruiter and I tell them my narrative and why I'm interested in the role. What happens next?
So there's usually 4 phases of every stage of interview. So there's 3 stages of interview. First is the recruiter screen. Second is the hiring manager screen. Third are the full interview loops. But within each of those, there are like 4 phases of the interview. The first phase is rapport. Talking about something like where you're calling in from, the weather, what you did on the weekend, doing any research that you were quickly able to ascertain from LinkedIn to drop something that might be similar or interesting to the individual. So first, rapport building. Second part is tell me about yourself or the narrative. The third part is the meat of the interview where questions are coming towards you. They're often coming from behavioral-based interviewing questions. So tell me about a time when you had a difficult stakeholder. Or tell me about a time when you had to work under a tight deadline. And there are specific ways to answer those questions. And then the fourth phase of every interview is what questions you have for me. And you don't want to just come up with them out of thin air. You want to have a couple prepared. I always suggest people should come with 3 questions at their ready. They don't need to use those. But if they're hemming and hawing at the end, when there is time for, like when the interviewer flips it onto you and says, what questions you have for me, you should have a couple of questions for them that are just not the generic ones, but something that are a little bit deeper and relevant to the role. So there's 3 stages of interviews, and within each stage, there are 4 phases within each of those interviews.
Yeah. They definitely don't make it easy on you.
Yeah.
I always really like that last stage of the interview, though, when it comes back to me where I get to ask the questions, because that is, like you said, if you do a good job preparing those, that's a good way to kind of demonstrate without, tooting your own horn that you've prepared for the interview, that you know a bit about the company. And I think that it's really fun to ask those questions, really like try to get the person's perspective as opposed to just get information, so like, how do you feel about the DE&I efforts that the company has been doing? Or, I saw this story in the news and, how did that rollout look like, internally at the company? Those are always really good moments to kind of parse the company culture without just being like, what's the company culture like? So I appreciate that. So I know we talked a bit about the behavioral interviews. I know we're going to get into that because I want to talk about the STAR story method. But before we do, can you talk a bit about, there used to be these goofy puzzle questions where it was like, how many baseballs can you fit in a football stadium? Which, why are you bringing baseballs to the football stadium? And things like that. So do the tech companies still ask those goofy puzzle questions? Should I be prepared for that?
They do not. Although when I interviewed at Google in 2011, I was still preparing for them. I was preparing for a similar sort of question of how many golf balls fill up a school bus, or how do you get a nickel out of a blender?
How do you get a nickel out of a blender?
I forget what the answer is. I forget, like I studied it back at the time. I know how to estimate the golf balls in the school bus, or at least how to approach a question like that. There were questions about how many airplanes are flying over Rochester right now, or something like that. And there are ways to attack that. But fortunately, these companies do not ask those anymore. They will ask case-based questions. They will ask analytical-based questions, but they're not brain teasers per se. So, for instance, I got a question once, and this is a question that would not be asked anymore, of at 3:15 on an analog clock, how many degrees of separation is a minute hand and the hour hand? And you can actually figure that out. It's actually an interesting puzzle, but like, does that really mean that you can work at Google or not? I didn't get that question at Google. I got that question at a finance company that I was doing analytics on. But a question that I did ask at Google, which was analytical and I thought thoughtful. Well, I kind of evolved it myself. It was in a Google interview bank, and then I evolved it a little bit. My question was, what do you think if Google started charging $5 a month for Gmail for the consumer version, not the enterprise version?
Mm-hmm.
You think that's a good idea or a bad idea? And what do you think the market opportunity is there? So I just want to have them think through how they would size that market opportunity. Like, do they understand how many people use email in the world? How many people are in the world? Like, I don't need them to know that there's 7.4 billion people in the world. But sometimes people will say, I don't know, it's a big opportunity. It was like, okay, can you quantify it? And people that can effectively quantify it stood out. So I would ask the question, say Google was looking to charge $5 a month for Gmail. What do you think of that idea? What do you think the opportunity is there? How would you go about estimating that size of that opportunity? What are the pros and cons of Google doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, what's your recommendation?
Mm-hmm.
And there's no right answer. There are wrong answers, though. Like, wrong answers were, Google can make $1 million on that, which would be way off by a scale of 10 to 100 times.
Mm-hmm.
But they had no substance behind that. But there were people that would break it down and analyze it effectively and ask good questions as well. So that was a good question that I would ask with Google's GCA portion. And Google has 4 different areas that they focus on. Google, Amazon, a few companies do a good job of really focusing their interview questions. And Google happens to focus on one key attribute of general cognitive ability. So that question was trying to assess, does this person have the analytical skills to break down a problem and think through something thoughtfully?
Mm-hmm.
But no more how many baseballs can fill up a football field.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting the way that sort of process has evolved over time, because it almost seems like the goofy puzzle questions are actually not goofy at all. They're just intended to be intimidating. They're really almost seems like they're intended to sort of throw you off your game. Whereas I think the case question that you introduced is not only relevant to probably the position that this person would be interviewing for, but also, offers the opportunity for you to just like slow down, break it down. And I like that you mentioned providing benefits and risks in your answer, because I do think oftentimes, when you get excited about a potential solution, you don't really think through what might go wrong. And bringing that to the interview shows, you might be somebody I want to work with. So that's a great way of thinking about it. Okay, next question for you. And this is going to come from a place of mistakes that I made for sure. I'll start off by just telling a bit of an anecdote, but as I was beginning to prepare for interviews last year, when I was first starting the recruiting process in the MBA program, I was reading 10Ks from companies like cover to cover. I was, drilling down and trying to figure out like why was there 12% growth in this particular line item year over year, and I was drafting some of the questions that I had for my interviewers based on this like incredibly minute granular knowledge that I'm sure that most, if not all of the people that I would be interviewing with were not thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So other than reading a 10K from back to front, how would you recommend that people begin to prepare for interviews, really from a broad sense, like learning about the company and kind of getting acclimated to what they should be prepared for going through the rest of those 4 stages you talked about earlier?
It's so funny. I made those same mistakes 17 years ago when I was in my MBA program. I remember like studying for interviews. I think it was either Citibank or L'Oreal. I forget who it was. And I was reading a 10K. And I noticed that their margins in EMEA, in Europe, Middle East, and Africa were dropping significantly. So I asked that question, and the interviewer had no idea. The interviewer was working like U.S. marketing, and they're like, I have no idea. So I never got asked back again after that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is not the right way to prepare. The right way to prepare is to think about those 4 phases of each interview. And you have to prepare differently for the recruiter screen. The recruiter is asking more surface level information to understand, do you have the subject matter expertise? And are you a decent person? And the hiring manager is looking more also for that, like subject matter expertise. They will dig in to like, hey, can Kelly do this job? Because I'm hiring this person on my team. I need Kelly to do this. Mm-hmm. And is Kelly a good person to manage? Because she will be reporting into me. Then the loops are trying to figure out, can you collaborate effectively? Do you have a good head on your shoulders? Do you have interpersonal skills? So that's what they're looking for. But thinking about the 4 different phases of the interview, first, building rapport. So do a little research on your interviewer, understand if they just joined the company, maybe where in the country that they're located. You can look on social media also, if they're on Facebook or Instagram or something like that. And just any rapport that you can build there within the first 2 to 4 minutes will, like, first impressions are key. So that's really critical. The second part is the narrative. So get your narrative down. Your 3 to 4 minutes, tell me about yourself. And the way you can get that down is practice and rehearse. We have some documents available at Kadima for how to create a narrative as well. But get that down and practice it with a friend, practice it in front of a mirror, practice it on video, because you're going to be doing it on video, and send it to a friend of yours and say, hey, how does this sound? And think about your narrative for the job. Most of your narrative will be the same, but the end will be, and that's why I'm really excited about Stripe and this particular role, which really emphasizes my skill set. And again, on the narrative, end with something personal. Not too personal, but something that gives you some humanity that, oh, and on the weekends, I like to play bocce, or I'm an avid gardener, or whatever it is. The third part are questions coming to you, and interviews will be 30 to 60 minutes. Most of them are 45 minutes, but about 25 or 30 minutes of that interview will be questions fired at you. And most of those questions will be behavioral based. So, like, tell me about a time, or explain something, a difficult situation you had to deal with. And there are ways to answer that. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Oh, we will.
On this show. And then the fourth one are what questions you have for me. And again, have those 3 questions prepared. And one of those questions should always be, depending on who you're meeting with. If you're meeting with a recruiter or you're meeting with a hiring manager, a totally legit question is, for the last question before you wrap up, what are the next steps and timing? I'm really excited about this role. And get that date and put that date down on your calendar. And either on that date or 1 day plus, follow up and say, hey, I'm just following up here about this. So that's how you can best prepare for the interviews. Also, you want to dress the part. A lot of these interviews are fairly casual, but you want to wear a button-down shirt if you're a guy. You want to wear something. I'm not good at fashion. I wear t-shirts all the time. I've hired people with t-shirts and hoodies. It doesn't really bother me. But you don't need to overdress. You don't need to wear a suit. You don't need to wear a sport coat or anything like that. But you want to look presentable, and ideally get all distractions out of the way. And then something that I always recommend people to do is to actually record their interview. Get a dictation app on your phone. On the Google Pixel, which only 5% of the population has, you can get Google Recorder. Comes on there. Really awesome. iPhone has some dictation apps as well. Record your interview, listen to it after. That will make you so much better. Not necessarily in that interview, but you will have a series of interviews, and that will help you get better. So that's how I suggested you prepare.
That's super helpful. Yeah, I like too that you mentioned asking 3 questions at the end, because one of the things that I found really helpful going through the interview process was just abiding by a general rule of 3s, because 3 is enough to make a list. 4 is too many that people are not going to remember what you're doing or talking about. But why me? Why now? Why this role? Super helpful. The 3 things that I've done in the past that make me equipped for this role, super helpful. And if you call those things out at the beginning too, then your interviewer kind of knows what to listen for. So it keeps them a bit more engaged, particularly if, it's a recruiter and they're doing like 10 of those screens a day. It can be helpful to sort of keep the conversation moving. So that's great. And I will also say, in terms of dressing the part, it's much easier to do that, from the waist up on Zoom. But I remember you shared a story about wearing a sport coat to your Google interviews and how it covered up your sweat because you were nervous throughout the whole day. So, maybe dress for whatever level of perspiration you're experiencing as well.
Exactly.
Awesome. So we have mentioned a couple times already about the behavioral based interviewing, but I'd love to hear you, Alan, explain the STAR method. This is something that is near and dear to probably every MBA's heart because it's drilled into us from day one. We talk a bit about sort of situation, task, action, and result, and how we leverage that in our behavioral interviews.
Yeah, happy to, Kelly. So behavioral-based interview Questions, if you're not familiar with that term, you can just Google that, but it's essentially tell me about blah, blah, blah. It usually goes like that. There's a couple of other words that can precede it of when was a time that you had to increase sales dramatically in a short period of time or something like that. What the interviewer is looking for is essentially for you to give them some context of the situation, for you to tell them what you did, and for you to communicate the results. And the acronym that has been drilled into my head for after my $138,000 that I invested in my MBA and has been drilled in your head, Kelly. And I think you got a scholarship. So congrats to you on that. So I don't think you invested as much money. But these MBA programs, which are churning out people that are getting jobs at like 90 to 100% success rate. And it's not just MBA programs. There's other ways to learn how to interview properly. There is a very clearly defined methodology to answer a question of, tell me about a time when you had a difficult stakeholder and you had to influence them to do something against their will. The way you do that is you say the situation was, I was working with this SVP and he was very closed-minded about the way that we should market this product. The task, I was tasked with launching this new product and I was responsible for $100 million P&L and I needed to launch it within the next month. The actions I took. First, I did some background research and I tried to understand what his concerns were about launching this product. Second, I dug into the data and I presented a fact-based argument to represent my case. Third, I got support from some other colleagues that I knew were influential with him. I ran it by them and I got their feedback. And fourth, I presented this to him and said, hey, can we test this out in a small sample and see how that works? And then based on that, we can launch that. As a result, this SVP gave me approval to sample it in 10% of the population. We launched that and we saw that we were able to increase sales by 50% in that 10% test versus the 90% control, we had flat revenue growth. So by showing that back to the SVP, I was able to convince him with data and results that our plan would in fact work. And we rolled out that test to the remainder of the 90%. And we exceeded our $100 million target by 12%. We got to $112 million within a 6-month period of time. And I received kudos from the SVP and I got a quick promotion after the fact as well. So what I did there, and that was just all bullshit, by the way, that I just came up with. Like I happen to be a good bullshitter. It's one of my skills.
That sounded great. Yeah, I believe you.
Yeah. But what you do is the situation is this, and you got to do that in 20 seconds. We should check back my timing to see how I did here with the timing, because I think I probably spend more time on the results than I did on the actions. Secondly, you spend about 20 seconds on the task. Then the meat and potatoes are the actions that you took. So maybe if this was actually a more legitimate story of mine, I could have said a little bit more detail of the actions that I took. And with those actions, you want to do a mix of what I did. And if you're a people leader or you work with others, we. And when you work with Amazon, you want to be heavy on the I versus the we. Other companies, it's more of a mix. You don't have to worry about that mix per se, but you want to be cognizant of using mostly I's and some we's as well with actions that you take. And then the result, make sure you can convey the result, and ideally with numbers, or ideally with I was the best salesperson on my team, or I got an award, or I got promoted, something so that that person can write down in their notes. And the top companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Salesforce, and there are other companies, they're all taking notes. You will often hear them typing their notes and they're putting that into their application tracking system. So that if I want to make a case at the end that I want to hire Kelly for this job, I need some supporting evidence. So I need to say, Kelly was really great. She launched this $100 million program and was able to influence senior level leaders. So you're giving me that ammunition that I can use to support you when that hiring conversation comes up. So That's a STAR method: situation, task, action, result. There's an alternative acronym also. I actually like better, but no one uses it. But this is what they taught me at Columbia. It's context, action, and result. So you kind of combine the situation and task. Whatever you use, the bigger part is the action and the results. But you do want to convey the story, and you want to make sure that you're not over talking them and not going into so much context where you're going to bore the hell out of them because they don't care. They want to know what you did, and they want to know what the results were.
Yeah. And that's where practice is key too. Because I think when we first start kind of coming up with our STAR stories in preparation for interviews, it can be very easy to be like, well, I took this action because, this other stakeholder on another team, either was hard to work with or there was some other project that nobody cares. So that's really helpful. And one other thing that I like about your example, even though, you said that it was totally made up, was that your actions had a good combination of both hard and soft skills. You talked about sort of the data and analysis that you worked with and did. And then you talked about how you communicated with other stakeholders and then ultimately presented to the SVP. So I think it's always good to sort of highlight your skills in both of those areas because, anybody who's hiring anybody probably wants to hire people who can do a bit of both. So
yeah,
super helpful. Yeah. And actually on the topic of STARs, again, I'll start with, how I do it or sort of like my anecdote, and then I'll ask you, but how would you recommend that either Kadima clients or SYCK Podcast listeners or really anybody looking to accelerate their career organizes this information? So for me, I had started off with a STAR spreadsheet where it was like going straight down and it was like situation, task, action, result in separate rows. And it wasn't until I actually inverted the spreadsheet and made it horizontal where I was actually telling the story instead of going down the list that I was like, oh, okay, these are stories. I can tell them in, 2 minutes or less. And then I made that one column with the action part really wide. So that was a good visual reminder for me to focus on the action, to emphasize the action as like the meat of the story. So how do you recommend that people organize those thoughts so that when they go into the interviews, they're prepared, particularly for Zoom interviews where they can have something open on their screen?
I work in spreadsheets. That's how mine works, but you can do this in a Word doc as well. And what I essentially do is I set up, there's probably 5 columns. The first is the question. And then the next 4 columns are situation, task, action, and result. And what I do is, like, there's a lot of questions out there and Kadima can offer them. You can Google them online, but there's questions like, tell me about a project or accomplishment you're proud of. I'm just looking at a list right now in front of me. Or tell me about a time when you had an interpersonal conflict at work. Or share a situation when you had to adapt the way you work in order to be successful. So there's a lot of these, the answers could be responded to the same question. So what I try to come up with is a bunch of successful outcomes that I've had and think about those results and then think about what the situation was and what the actions I took. And I come up with about 10, eventually to 20 of these stories of accomplishments that I've done that, hey, I went from being one of the worst managers at Google to getting one of the top 25 managers across Google. So that was like one of my key accomplishments. So what are the actions that I took to get there? Or I launched a new customer segmentation program while at Tableau, and we were able to drive $200 million more revenue. So there's another example. And then I build out the situation, the task, action, and result. So I come up with a lot of the stories, and then I just bullet point in my head. I don't write a script because you're not going to be able to rehearse that script. But I have at my beck and call about 10 to 20 different accomplishments that I've had. And then I try to apply them the best I can when a question comes up. And I use those questions as a starter. But what I'm really trying to do is come up with 10 to 20 STAR stories, things that I'm proud of in my career. It can be in the work environment. It can be interpersonally as well, although you want to do more work. It can be in the academic world. Like if you're relatively new in your career and you have something, maybe you launched a new club or a new organization, something like that while on campus. And you just come up with those and you have those in front of you. And then you practice those. And I would practice them in the shower, or you can practice them while you're walking. And you don't need to go through it verbatim, but you need to know off the top of your head that there's like 10 or 15 things that you're proud of that you can leverage and apply to a variety of different questions. So that's what I do. And again, it's practice as well. So it's practicing saying these in front of the mirror. It's practice like timing it as well and recording yourself and saying, hey, make sure you can convey this in 4 minutes or so, 4 to 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And maybe working with a buddy and having them test you and see if it's working well. And then it's practice with real interviews and take a lot of interviews. And if you're not that interested in the company, take the interview anyway. Just practice your skills. Don't wait for only like A-listed companies to interview you that you would definitely accept the offer. If there's a company that reaches out to you, a headhunter that reaches out to you that is semi-interesting, take the interview, practice your skills. You will get better.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that you point out 10 to 20 star stories because I do think it is an iterative process. I mean, especially as you start writing them down, you come up with other ones and then there are different questions that, you can apply the same story to. You don't ever really want to make, your stories be sort of one size fits all, but you can sort of elicit different elements of like the same work accomplishment to answer a question about like using a lot of data to drive decision making or working with, again, difficult stakeholders. That one always, I feel like, comes up. One thing that I did that I found really helpful, and, we mentioned earlier that there are some companies that you might really love and some that you might not. So when I started interviewing, I was not even applying to Amazon, but Amazon's 16 leadership principles is an excellent place to start when you're building out your star stories. As you know, we just had Eric Hudson on the podcast talking about the bar raiser interview. And one of the things that he talked about is that if you can interview successfully at Amazon, you can interview successfully anywhere. So I recommend looking at the leadership principles. You can just Google them. We can add them to the show notes. But if you have 16 stories to talk about each one of those, it's like customer obsession, we're right a lot and things like that, then you're already well on your way to transforming those for pretty much any company too. So I think that's
cool. And Amazon is probably the most rigorous with their interview process. I was at Google. I interviewed 1,000 people at Google, and Google's quite rigorous too. So Google is not a cakewalk. Amazon kind of takes it to a different degree, applying their own standard operating procedures to it. So at Kadima, we generally teach people for the Amazon method, because if you can do Amazon, you can do any other interview. And it is about getting all those different stories and practicing them and having them at the top of your mind. But as you said, also with Zoom interviews now, you can have it on another screen or you can have it down below, and you can take 5 seconds or to pause when someone says, tell me about a time when you had an ambiguous situation and you had to provide clarity to that. You can think a little bit. You can say, hey, can you give me a few seconds to think about a good example? And you can look down or you can look on your screen. But I would not generally give people the guidance to continue looking at the screen. You should get these at the top of your head. And if you don't remember the exact results that you delivered, you could say, you can make an estimate. No one's going to really pressure test that you increase sales by 12% versus 14%. So you don't need to memorize all those stats.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I also find, on that same token of taking a few seconds before answering a question, that is like not a natural thing for humans to do. We want to keep the conversation flowing, but particularly when there are questions. And I've seen this come up a lot, both as, someone helping other people interview and as an interviewee myself. If there's a multi-part question, which interviewers love to ask, if you don't jot down each part of those questions. So your example, I would be writing down ambiguous and clarity. So I want to make sure I talk about what was ambiguous about it and how I provided clarity. Because otherwise, you're going to get caught up in your story and you're going to totally forget one part of the question. And it's almost even more awkward to go back and be like, oh, wait, I forgot to tell you about the ambiguity in the situation. So super helpful to just slow down and think about it, right?
That's a great point. And sometimes I find it helpful to repeat the question back, or not in total, but just to confirm. So what you're looking for is an ambiguous situation where I was able to provide clarity or and make sure that you get alignment, that you're answering the right thing, because there's been so many times when I've interviewed people where they're not answering the question I'm asking them. It happens probably 30 to 50% of the time that someone's not answering the question, not even like vaguely. So maybe it's not that high, but an unusually a surprisingly high amount of time. So you want to make sure you have clarity on what they're seeking and that you are answering it in a succinct manner as well. So
Awesome. Well, Alan, I know we are almost out of time here. So one last question for you. So we talked about the 4 different stages of interviewing. Let's say, hopefully I'm getting through most, if not all of them. So let's say I get to the end of the interview process. Everything's out of my hands now. Can you talk a bit about what happens there on the company side? So what's the weight of the decision making? Are they looking at my performance in the interview? Are they looking at my overall fit? Are they like, well, Kelly's worked in this capacity before, so we should give her this job, even if she didn't answer these questions well? What's happening behind those closed doors?
Yeah. So what happens then, especially at the top tech companies, is not only did they have the pleasure of meeting with you, Kelly, but they had the pleasure of meeting with 3 to 4 other eminently qualified candidates. Mm. And so there's usually 4 or 5 people that people are talking in a room about. And of those 4 or 5, usually there's, just by the law of numbers, there's usually a couple that were clear, not good. So you eliminate those. Mm-hmm. And then you talk about each of them. It depends on the company. Some of them had different processes of going through it. But you talk about the different candidates and then you evaluate essentially at all the companies I worked at, is this person a hire or no hire? And if they are a hire, then if there's only one, and it's clear that Kelly is the top, let's go with Kelly. Mm-hmm. And we might
Sounds keep, great. Let's do that.
Yeah. Well, we will keep, if there's some others that are hireable, we will keep them warm because we don't know if Kelly's going to accept our offer. So we will delay with candidate number 2 and 3. Mm-hmm. And we will reach out to you very quickly and say, hey, Kelly, we'd love to make you an offer and let's try to nail this down. Mm-hmm. So we may be slow to respond to the other couple, but we're quick to reply to you. Also, what's occurring is sometimes we're figuring out what sort of level you can come in at, because there's sometimes flexibility, there's, especially at Amazon, they have a lot of flexibility. So they interview you for a role and then they kind of identify what level you interviewed at, or you were able to communicate your experience and skills at. Not every company is as flexible about that. I've had flexibility in some roles where you can move this role up or down in one level. So there's talk about that at times. There's also talk about compensation. So what usually happens is the recruiter will tell me as a hiring manager, okay, we're ready to make an offer for Kelly. She's based in Rochester, but she's moving to Chicago. So our pay grade for Chicago is 110 to 140. So we suggest that we start with 120. And I was like, okay, fine. And then they make the offer to you and hopefully you accept it. Mm-hmm. But if you go back for negotiation, depending on how high you want to go, if it's within the 140, it's a pretty easy conversation between me and the recruiter. If you wanted 170, then we have to have a conversation, me and the recruiter, of is it worth making an exception for Kelly? Or is she just totally out of whack here? And then we go to Ralph or whoever was number 2 mm-hmm. on the list. So there's a little bit of that at play as well. And then we also, after we extend that offer, we still have to make sure that the background checks go through and everything works out there. So we are still keeping candidate 2 and 3 warm, which is frustrating for that candidate because mm-hmm. we already told those candidates that we're going to get back to you by Tuesday. Well, we got back to Kelly by Tuesday, but those other candidates we're keeping warm. Mm-hmm. Candidate 4 and 5, we might have told them that they got rejected. But if you're on the fence, you're going to be kind of in this limbo. And you're like, why aren't they reaching out to me? They said they were going to reach out to me on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And you might send them a note and they might be truthful to you and tell you what the situation is. I always was with candidates, but you might, I've worked with recruiters that are hesitant to say that. And they're like, oh, I don't want to convey to them that they're our second choice. I was like, well, it's second choice at Facebook or Google. Who cares? But anyway, different recruiters were different at conveying that information to people. So then we just are frustrating to you. And we're like, oh, we're trying to get the team together for our hiring committee or what have you. And it's frustrating for you.
Yeah. Well, it's helpful to hear all of the things that are happening simultaneously. Because, sometimes as a candidate, you get the sense that maybe they're just back to their day-to-day lives and they're not even thinking about the hiring process anymore. And so it's helpful to know, even if I'm not hearing back, that sometimes no news can be good news, or sometimes no news is no news. but no news doesn't mean that there's nothing happening.
Although no news could be that nothing's happening. So recruiting is not the most operationally efficient process. The recruiter has 20 plus roles simultaneously to fill with 5 to 10 candidates per role. They're supposed to get back to people, but they are not measured on the candidate experience. They're measured on the speed of filling the role. So after they filled Kelly's role, they might forget to go back to Ralph and Puneet and tell them that, oh, by the way, you didn't get the role.
That hurts, but yeah.
So that stuff happens all the time. And even companies that are really good with their operational rigor, like Amazon, they still have me in their ATS or application tracking system for being an active candidate for about 5 or 6 roles that I have submitted as far back as 2017 and as late as 2020. They have a lot of roles that they've processed on me that I've either interviewed and got to the final rounds and got rejected or whatever. But there are a lot of roles that they've done nothing with, and it still says active on their portal for me.
Yeah. Alan, this was really helpful. I mean, I personally, having just gone through this process as an MBA candidate, I think that I still picked up some new tips from you. And I think even just laying it out step by step is really, really helpful. So hopefully our listeners appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I hope so. Recruiting is a really poor process, and you are at an imbalance at the candidate versus the company. So the more light that we can shed on this, the more information and confidence we can provide you with, the better. So keep at it. It's a tough process, but there are lots of jobs out there and people do succeed. And you just got to deal with the rejection, deal with the inefficiency, deal with the biases in the process, and go for those great jobs.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Kelly.
Awesome questions from Kelly, and that wraps up another jam session with Alan Stein. Alan, you've actually made it extremely easy for your audience to ask their own questions for the show. That little button that says leave Alan a voice message, it's right there on the website at SYCKpodcast.com. That's SYCK, correct?
That's correct. I listen to them all. It's the best way that my mom knows how to get in touch with me.
So the funny thing is this podcast is gaining momentum, and there's going to be a point where you're going to have to hire a team to listen to the messages, you think? We hope.
That's true. It's still manageable by me, but it is starting to add up. I do appreciate all those messages. I do still listen to all those messages. I do intend to continue to listen to all those messages for as long as possible.
I love that you do that. Well, thank you for listening to the SYCK Podcast today. And for your host, Alan Stein, I'm Russ Reba. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You are certainly going to love the next one.